The investigation has, of course, the world once again focusing on Yemen. Al-Qaeda militants believed to be behind the failed plot are said to be based in Yemen. The US says it is looking at ways to expand military and intelligence aid to the Yemeni government in exchange for a crackdown on al-Qaeda. And just today, Yemeni forces stormed an al-Qaeda hideout in the country's east, arresting at least one al-Qaeda member. Yemen, if you don't already know, is one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, and it has become an important training ground for al-Qaeda operatives and is on the verge of becoming a failed state, according to many people. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has spent time in Yemen and explained what the US is up against.
It is a country that traditionally does not welcome outsiders. It's a very tribal society, and that is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to govern. You have these small tribes that are well armed. There are about 3 weapons for every person in Yemen, and these tribes don't listen to the government. They don't want outsiders. They will not welcome airstrikes, particularly if they're seen to be carried out by the Americans. It could just make it worse.
Well, joining us now for more on Yemen's economy is Eurasia Group Middle East analyst David Bender. David, great to have you on the show today. You know, the things that we hear about Yemen suddenly in the spotlight, it's got 35% unemployment, it's got civil war going on, it's on the brink of economic collapse. It certainly sounds like a great breeding ground for terrorists. How concerned should the world be about this country?
I think the world should be very concerned about Yemen these days, that historically the Yemeni government has never ruled the entire country, and it's been able to make deals with all of these tribes, compromising payoffs, occasionally fighting. But I think right now we're facing a substantially different sort of threat. Right now the Yemeni government is dealing with, I would say, 3 really existential threats. The first, most serious one is probably the rebellion in the north by a group known as the Houthis. The second is that there's growing secessionist pressures in the south of the country. And lastly, as we're now talking about, is the al-Qaeda threat. And ever since al-Qaeda about a year ago sort of incorporated as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, we see an al-Qaeda in Yemen that has deep connections within the country and is able to exploit the tribal structure. But at the same time, it has a growing international perspective. And I think we will see Yemen popping up increasingly in international terrorist operations.
So what do you believe can be done either by the Yemeni government, which sounds as if they don't have much power or resources, or even by foreign powers such as the United States?
Well, it's a difficult situation. I think the U.S. has made it very clear over the last several years that it wants to cooperate with the Yemeni government, and by and large, the Yemeni government in Sana'a is allied with the United States and will work with the United States on terrorism. I think there are just a lot of questions about to what extent the outside world can help Yemen. Recently we see the Saudis are beginning to help the Yemenis in northern Yemen with their rebellion against the Houthis, and there have been Saudi military operations inside the country. I think that we now see the U.S. and Saudi Arabia willing to work inside Yemen, but it's not clear that can do very much.
You know, one of the problems is that quite often you see that if a country doesn't have much economic importance to the outside world, then it tends to be left alone a little bit. And we've certainly seen this with North Korea. Do you feel that there is an oil connection here? I mean, obviously about 80% of the government's revenues do come from oil, but the oil is dwindling. The country's in crisis. Is there an important oil connection either to Saudi Arabia or to the United States?
Well, I think the oil issue is just another sign of how much more difficult the situation in Yemen is going to become. I mean, I don't think it's very difficult to come up with an optimistic scenario for Yemen over the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's this or worse. The oil is indeed running out. It's been declining oil production. It's now down to about 400,000 barrels a day, and it's projected to indeed run out over the next couple of decades. Water resources are dwindling as well. Water in the highlands in particular is set to run out also within the next 10 to 20 years. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, has taken a greater interest in Yemen, in realizing that the short-term threat from Yemen is an al-Qaeda presence there that's looking to have attacks in the region, but that the long-term risk relating to Yemen now is the prospect of a collapsed Yemeni state that would send potentially millions of impoverished refugees into Saudi Arabia and destabilizing the region. And I think that right now, when we take all of these things in whole, Looking at Saudi Arabia, I would say the greatest threat to Saudi stability right now does not come from Iraq or Iran, which make the headlines, but rather it comes from chaos in Yemen.
It certainly sounds like it's coming from what we would originally have thought of an unlikely source. You said that there is the potential longer term to destabilize the region if things do get out of hand. The markets seem to be shrugging off all of this. They seem to be a little bit complacent. Do you think too complacent?
Well, I think that what we're talking about is long-term risks. I think the short-term risk of al-Qaeda being able to set up camps inside Yemen, it certainly is there, but al-Qaeda has shown limited ability to hit soft targets in Saudi Arabia, although not recently. They've never shown the ability to hit oil targets. They've had limited success striking political targets, so I don't know that there's really any short-term downside to what's going on in Yemen. But I think when we look long-term, of the potential of a collapsed Yemeni state in the Arabian Peninsula really is a very dangerous prospect. But I think that is a somewhat longer-term concern that markets probably shouldn't worry about right now, but certainly that countries in the region are very concerned about.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
We're talking
Good to be here.
Thank you.